Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hi, welcome to another new episode of Elanomics. Before we begin this week's episode, I would first of all like to thank all the viewers and readers of the print who have taken subscriptions and who have supported the journalism we do and the good journalism we are trying to maintain all through these years. We are a young organization, and you know how difficult the situation in the economy is, and we need people to pay for what they read, what they watch online, because good journalism needs people to pay for it. And if you have not taken subscriptions and if you have not subscribed to the print, please visit our website, theprint.in/subscribe. There are sections for international viewers and subscribers and domestic subscribers separately. Please do take subscriptions, and we need your support for this. This week, we will talk about inflation targeting. And the issue here is, over the last few days and a couple of weeks, there has been a lot of talk and clamor on the RBI's inflation targeting regime, or the policy, if you want to call it. The RBI has to maintain inflation between 2 and 6%. Its target is 4%, plus or minus 2% percentage points, actually. But this has now gotten into a debate that this is affecting growth, this is affecting interest rates, and everybody is saying maybe this is not everybody, experts and analysts and some economists are saying this is not the right way to go about it. What is the reality here? We have Professor Ela Patnaik to talk about it. Ela, why has this clamor, as you say, started now, that there is something wrong with this inflation targeting regime or policy?
There are many people who argue that it's time for a rate cut. And actually, when you look at it, then yes, rates have been cut, but the argument is that rates would have been cut much more if we didn't have an inflation targeting regime. So given that there is an economic slowdown, the need that people feel that, let interest rates be much lower, let investment increase, let output increase, let employment increase. That need is, I suppose, greater, because of which a lot of people have started saying, let's just throw away the regime, throw away this entire framework. So that's the most recent trigger.
But if you can see, this inflation targeting has not been around for too long. It's a very recent policy. I think 2016 or 2015 was when they put it into place. What was the background of bringing this here, this regime, Ela?
The background was the higher volatile inflation until the mid-2010s. So when you look back, you see that inflation would rise to 7%, 8%, 9%. And it was also, sometimes it would fall to 3 or 4%. So it was high and it was volatile. And there are two reasons why you would think that you want to move to inflation targeting. The first, of course, is that a large mass of the people, the poor, those who have salary, fixed incomes, whose incomes don't move with inflation, plus the old, the pensioners, who don't want high prices to erode whatever wealth they have, they would prefer a lower rate of inflation. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that, the experience of a lot of countries, or the empirical evidence, suggested that actually a low and stable inflation rate is good for businesses to be certain about, more certain, there's never complete certainty, but would be less uncertain, maybe I should say, less uncertain about the future, and therefore more willing to invest. So actually, instead of there being that sort of a trade-off between investment and output on the one side and inflation on the other, experience suggests that actually low and stable inflation rates are good for a business environment. Mm-hmm. And when you have very high inflation, I mean, we've seen countries that have tried to inflate their way to growth, and they don't really succeed. I mean, they get into hyperinflation if they really try to inflate their way and think that by just having higher and higher inflation, they'll be able to have higher growth. Life is not that easy. And those countries actually get into trouble. So the objective was, how do we get away from this high volatile inflation and put in place a regime which gives us low and stable inflation, primarily working through, so we know our monetary policy transmission is very weak. So this primarily works through anchoring inflation expectations. So, when you are getting into a contract, you think, inflation will be 5%. Decade ago, if you were doing a rental contract, you would be putting in 10% increases every year, or a wage contract. And those contracts actually push up prices. Because if you've already written down that next year, I'm going to increase salaries of this organization by 10%, or I'm going to increase rents by 10%, then those feed into the costs, and they, by raising costs, actually push you into this wage price spiral.
But
so that's broadly the experience of the Indian macroeconomy that got us there.
But this whole regime, Ela, has its pros and cons. It's not like just a black and white. So what are the pros of having a targeting regime? Because people have now started blaming it for a lot of problems, like we started discussing this.
So you see, every policy has trade-offs. It has gainers and it has losers. So let's talk about who are the losers out of an inflation targeting regime. Those who borrow would like high inflation, because then they return less in real terms than what they borrowed. Also, borrowers would constantly like to see low real interest rates, okay? And they think that you might get low real interest rates by having a higher rate of inflation that gets your real interest rate to be much lower. So currently, when you look around, there are people who would argue that if interest rates were lower, maybe credit would pick up. If real rates were low, if inflation was higher, and if, effectively I'm going to borrow 100 today, but in real terms I'm going to repay 70 when it comes for time to repay, then I'm more willing to borrow. So borrowers benefit when there is higher inflation. Now, what you see, there's a very interesting analysis of countries and demographics and inflation, which shows you that when countries are older, Japan and Europe, older countries prefer lower inflation. Because when you are older, you depend on your savings, on your financial assets that you have saved while you were working. And those are going to get eroded with higher inflation. So actually there's a large lobby of people there's a large group of people who would stand to lose if there was higher inflation. And
so if you mean by older countries, countries with older populations.
So countries with larger, older population mean that there are more people who would lose if inflation was higher. And that, obviously, all of this creeps into the system through their elected representatives, preferences of what laws are made, what parliaments do, what frameworks are adopted, come from, people and the lobbies. So in the present situation in India, because there are a lot of people who are, business is not finding adequate investment opportunities, is unhappy about the regime. So you do hear these voices that they would like to borrow effectively. I mean, but they don't really say we want high inflation. They don't say we want inflation of 10%, 15%, because that seems to be a very politically incorrect thing to do, because there are losers. But they just say that, we should get rid of inflation targeting. So the whole, the clamor that you hear, I think, is much more when growth is lower, investment is lower, like in the current situation.
There's an interesting point, and actually you have illustrated it with some graphs and charts in your column this week. You will have that in the description of this video to be able to read it. where you show that actually rates have been cut quite a bit despite this inflation targeting regime being in place.
Absolutely. So if you put that graph up on the screen, then I think everyone will be able to see that, there's a vertical line where I show that that's the time when in March 2016, you put in place a formal inflation targeting framework. And then just look at the rate cuts after that. So it's not as if we got, high interest rates. The repo rate wasn't cut. The policy, it wasn't as if it wasn't cut. It has actually been cut quite sharply. And, actually that is the right time to do inflation targeting because this is more acceptable to people. So in that sense, India made the right choice that when we moved to inflation targeting, so we moved informally, we set up something called the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement in March 2015, and then we moved to the formal amendment of the RBI Act and the preamble and the amendment that gave us the full inflation targeting framework in March 2016. So I would say from that time onwards, then an MPC was set, the Monetary Policy Committee was set up, external members were put into that committee, so half RBI, half external. And that has been regularly meeting every 2 months and deciding the interest rate. And you see that the rates have come down. And then the second chart shows you, the second chart is a chart of inflation, which also you should put up so the viewers can see this, that at the same time, inflation is lower. It's lower and more stable. So what might appear to be a contradiction, what, the common man thinks is that if you want to, the non-macroeconomist, I should say, argues that if you're going to have lower inflation, then you will raise interest rates. But you put these two charts together and you're clearly seeing that we got lower inflation and we got lower rates. So actually we benefited from the framework because it anchored inflationary expectations. It's not that a monetary policy transmission mechanism is that great, that it worked through the normal channels of the wealth effect and so on, but it was so much more that inflationary expectations were in place. So that's the point one is making, that don't assume that an inflation targeting regime means you'll have high interest rates, you have cuts, and yet you have lower inflation.
In fact, I was coming to that point you're making about the second graph, which actually shows inflation being stable compared to the earlier volatility, and which, as some of us, journalists who also track politics, we don't hear the word mehengai so much like we used to hear before. So whether that's a political target or a political design, price rise has been kept rather stable. Is that a correct assessment, Ela?
Absolutely. And that's happened not just in India. It's happened in many of the countries. So I'm not saying that every inflation targeting regime is a success. No, there are many difficulties. We always have pros and cons. But when you're looking for what are the policies that have been able to provide a certain sort of macro stability, and you look at whether countries after adopting inflation targeting have been able to get their inflation rates down and make them more low and stable, then yes, that's the experience you've had in other countries. And now think about, why would politicians not choose to change the law? Because if by changing a law, they can do something which makes their voters happy, by setting up a framework for the central bank, who of course then they can also blame if inflation is higher than it should be. So, they actually benefit twice over from it. First, that in all likelihood, through this mechanism, they'll be able to bring down the inflation rate. And second, that if they're not able to do so, then because now there's an institutional framework and the central bank is responsible for keeping inflation low and within that band, so the politicians don't have to bear the brunt of the anger of the public when prices do rise very fast. So you do find that many countries, many democracies particularly, have moved to inflation targeting.
But so the demand to abandon inflation targeting altogether is not something that will take us down the right path.
I mean, the first question I would ask is that, okay, so then what is the inflation rate that you're comfortable with? So if you were asking me that you were saying that this is not a good policy, then I'd say, okay, you can, in the present framework, change the rate. So if you're not happy with this, make it 6%. In 2021, that is what is up for review. So a lot of people have been doing some loose talk as if the whole framework is up for review. It is not. What the inflation targeting framework says is that every 5 years, the rate, the target, the number is up for review. And you can choose that, okay, you don't like 4 for some reason. 4 plus minus 6 is not something you like. Choose another number. So that's the first question I would ask. Is your unhappiness with the number, or is your unhappiness with the framework? If your unhappiness is with the framework, what is the alternative that you're proposing? Do we go back to, the sort of multiple target approach that we used to have, where inflation was, as my graph clearly shows, higher and more volatile? Or do we look at how in this period it's been low, it's been stable, and it's not as if interest rates have risen that much, nominal interest rates have risen that much. So, you have to come up with an alternative. Another alternative that is being proposed, one is just abandon this. And another alternative is let's switch to nominal GDP as the target. Now, nominal GDP as the target means GDP can go up, nominal GDP can go up if prices rise. That's all. So you could have a target which is met if prices go up. I don't think that's what people want. They want more output, not just high prices. And second, with the GDP the way it is, with its measurement the way it is, it'll be quite a long time before we can be happy with a target of nominal GDP, even if one was to sort out all the problems that exist with it.
Do you think next year the number should be changed? Do you have a different number in your mind?
No, I don't think the number should be changed. I think maybe it's time for us to start narrowing the band a little.
Okay.
So it's a very wide band. And when the decision was taken for this
targeting,
rather wide band, it was because we are a new inflation targeting regime. We may not be able to actually contain inflation in this band. And, so let's keep it loose so that it doesn't give the wrong signal, too much tightening doesn't happen, or let people get used to it. I think the experience has been pretty good. Again, referring back to my chart. And for most of the period, the inflation rate has been within the band, and we could, from 2, we could go to 1.5, 1.5. So just to make it a little more precise, but no, I don't think that, I think a little below 4 is good. And the reason for that is because, after all, dependent on your inflation rate is what your expectations of the exchange rate depreciation will be. And, given our productivity levels, compare them to the productivity levels of the rest of the world, what you do want is an external equilibrium as well. You think about a currency in a country which is, suppose I was to say that let the inflation rate be 10%. Now, if our target is made 10%, you would find that the rupee starts depreciating very rapidly. Because, in the terms of the rupee dollar rate, with the US target being 2, and inflation rate sometimes even below that. But let's just say the target is, we stick to the target, which is 2. We can't afford to be at 10 because we get a lot of external volatility. The exchange rate will depreciate fast. There may be capital flight because of exchange rate depreciation. It can induce expectations of depreciation, and thus it can induce capital flight. There can be difficulties in terms of planning imports and investment. So if you think from the perspective of where you are in the international economy, I think where we are is fine.
So the conclusion, Ela, is that this is actually the inflation targeting regime has been an achievement of the current Modi government, and you give credit where it is obviously due, which is very rare because the government has not given too much. This government has not given too much credit when it comes to the economy, and there are things that have they have not got right. But if they've got something right on the economy, that credit should be given. Thank you for watching this episode of Elanomics. We will be back next week with another one. Please do also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have lots of other videos there. Thank you very much.